Well, we are starting a new series looking at covenants in the Bible as we enter the season of Lent. And I know I just dropped several church lingo words in one sentence. Let's unpack that. What is Lent? Lent is a season of about 40 days before Easter where we prepare our hearts, our minds, and souls for Jesus' death on the cross and his resurrection on Easter. Now, Advent is the season before Christmas where we prepare for Jesus' birth. Lent is the season before Easter when we prepare for his death. So if Advent is like the last trimester of a pregnancy, the baby's on the way, get ready, then Lent is like the last season of life when a loved one is in hospice and receiving minimal care. The end is close. Get ready. Now, we often talk about giving up something for Lent as part of this preparation process, but we've already given up hugs and potlucks and seeing people's faces, below the eyes. So maybe we've given up enough already, and we don't need to add anything else this year. I'll leave that as a decision to you. But I digress. We're in Lent, which means we're preparing for Jesus' death on our behalf. That's what Lent means. That's the first church lingo word defined. What about covenant? Now, if you've been in churches most of your life, you probably already knew what Lent was, but what about covenant? If I asked you to define covenant, what would you say? And how confident are you that you can capture, the rich meaning that is present in the Bible when it says covenant? It's a hard one for us. No matter if you've been following Jesus for decades or you're still unsure about him, it's a difficult word because covenant is not a word that we use anymore in regular day-to-day life. It's part contract, part promise, part solemn oath, part marriage, and part mind-blowing act of the living God. In the Bible, this is a big-time word. And there's a scene in the movie Jerry Maguire. Jerry's a sports agent, and he loses almost all of his clients, and he shows up to his top client's house, who's projected to be the number one pick in the NFL draft, and he's trying to get him back. And the dad, his name is Matt Cushman. The dad says, I don't do contracts, but what you do have is my word, and it's stronger than oak. And that's inspiring. Right? Jerry's inspired. He takes that. My word is stronger than oak. That's the kind of firmness that is implied by the word covenant. But, and this is a pretty big but, later in the movie, there's another scene. And right before his client is going to be drafted number one overall, it's draft night, Jerry realizes that another agent, Bob Sugar, has been trying to steal this top client. And Jerry says to Matt, you didn't sign anything with with Sugar, right? Tell me you didn't sign because I'm still sort of moved by your my word is stronger than oak thing. And Matt's quiet for a little bit and he says, we signed with Sugar about an hour ago. So that demonstrates the problem with every human example we can find when we try to figure out what the Bible means by the word covenant, because every human who makes an oath can break it. Every human who says, my word is stronger than oak, like Matt Cushman, can be swayed. Every human who signs a contract can violate its terms. Every human marriage can fall apart. We, and by we I mean all humans, we are unreliable. That's why biblical covenants are a little bit different, fundamentally different, in fact, because our text today is the first formal biblical covenant, and it begins with God saying, I am establishing my covenant with you. Biblical covenants are fundamentally different because they aren't based on the unreliable commitment of humans. Biblical covenants are based on the character and commitment of God. Sometimes God puts some terms on the covenant. There are sometimes consequences for the people who don't live up to what God expects. But the covenants themselves are based on God's word, not ours. Based on God's character, not ours. Based on God's promises, not ours. In many respects, a biblical covenant is kind of like humans waving the white flag of unconditional surrender. Once you have given unconditional surrender, you no longer have a seat at the bargaining table. You no longer have any leverage. You no longer get to dictate any terms. God just chooses to establish a covenant with us. Now, luckily for us, God loves us and chooses to make these covenants as a source of blessing, not a source of curse. So taking all of this context in, I would define a biblical covenant as an unshakable promise that God makes to people. God chooses the terms of that promise. God chooses what he expects of us. God chooses every aspect of the covenant. So a biblical covenant is an unshakable promise that God makes to people. So we'll put these two church lingo concepts together. We are in Lent, preparing for the death of Jesus on our behalf. And just like a family reminding themselves of the key stories of a loved one's life when they are about to die, we are preparing for Jesus' death this year by reminding ourselves of some of the most important things that God said throughout the Bible. And those are God's covenants. So let's hear about this first formal covenant from Genesis chapter 9. Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, "As for me, I am establishing my covenant with you and your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the domestic animals, and every animal of the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark. I establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood, never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth." And God said, "This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I have set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth." And God said to Noah, "This is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth." This is the word of the Lord, so thanks be to God. Well, I vividly remember one evening when I was in high school. I was chatting online with one of my friends, and I was pretty depressed that evening. I don't remember why I was so depressed. It was probably like dating relationship trouble or something else temporary that I thought was earth-shattering and permanent at the time. But whatever the reason, I remember being extremely depressed. And I was chatting online with my friend, and I typed to him that if I were God, and if I knew ahead of time how humans, like me, would mess things up so badly, I would never have created us in the first place. I don't remember what my friend responded. I think by this point in the evening, he might have gotten tired of my overly depressed comments, and he may have signed off or something. I don't remember how he replied, but I remember writing that. Now, in the story of Noah, we actually get a little bit of insight into God's thought process, kind of along that line of thinking that I was talking about when I was in high school. Noah's story starts off with this observation from 3 chapters before, Genesis chapter 6. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all of the time. And the Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth. His heart was deeply troubled, so the Lord said, "I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race that I have created, with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have made them." But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God. As I read that, I actually kind of have a hard time relating to the people in this story. On the one hand, we have this like massive humanity where the text says every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all of the time. I mean, that's like saying like everyone on earth is a supervillain from a Marvel movie, right? Only evil thoughts all the time. Pretty intense. Even on my worst day, I don't think I went the whole day with only evil thoughts all of the time. I can't relate to that. And on the other hand, we got Noah, who is like righteous and blameless and faithful. I mean, that's like the superhero Captain America, right? Even on my best day, I don't know that I went the whole day being righteous and faithful and blameless. I can't really relate to that either. But that's how this story starts. It's like God looks down and sees this teeming mass of supervillains all over the earth. So he says, I'm going to wipe them out with a flood. I guess none of them had like water-breathing supervillain powers. But look here. Oh, it's Captain America Noah. So God says, I'm going to save Captain America Noah and his family and a bunch of animals on a boat. It's kind of a weird story, right? But superhero Noah wins at the end of the day. And he gets to snuggle with kittens and puppies and lambs while he's on a boat. So there's this nice, heartwarming final shot of the movie to send you out with all the good feels. Now, if that were the real end of this movie, if that were the whole story here, then the lesson would be pretty simple and a pretty scary one. Be good, or God will drown you and your pets too. Right? But that's not the end of the story here. This is not the end of the movie. The Bible keeps going. And in fact, the whole supervillains versus Captain America bit, the whole catastrophic flood and the animals on the boat, that part, that's just setting the stage for what is the actual important part of the story. You see, the story of the flood isn't really a story about a flood. It's a story about a promise, a story about a covenant. Yeah, there's a flood in the opening chapters of the story, but the story is not about the flood. The story is about the promise, the oath, the covenant from the living God that is offered after the flood. To keep it simple, the promise, the covenant goes like this. God says, I promise not to destroy you. That's really what it amounts to. It gets restated a few different ways, but really it's, I promise not to destroy you. Why does that matter? Well, it matters in the context of this story because of what God didn't say. God didn't say, I promise not to destroy all of the righteous, blameless, upright people who are like Captain America Noah. God doesn't say that. God also does not say, I promise not to destroy you as long as you don't just become as bad as those supervillains were. God doesn't say that either. In fact, there is not a condition for this promise in our text today. God chooses not to destroy us. End of story. Even if we deserve to be destroyed. And this next part is fascinating. If you keep reading in Genesis right after our text today, Captain America Noah, upright, blameless, faithful, gets drunk and passes out naked on the floor. Not so blameless now, huh, Noah? But what's interesting is he's not condemned. He's not destroyed. He's not written off. The drunken Noah story shows us that a major shift has taken place. A huge tectonic shift has taken place in our story because God has chosen not to give up on us, even when we deserve it. Especially when we deserve it, God has chosen not to give up on us. Even if you're feeling closer to the supervillains than Captain America Noah, God has not given up on you. Not because you deserve it or have earned it. None of us have earned it. God's promise is God's choice. That's it. That's the real point of this story, is that God has chosen not to give up on us and not to give up on you. If you're feeling as depressed as I was on that day in high school, God has not given up on you. If you are feeling hopeless right now, God has not given up on you. If you are feeling like you have done something unforgivable, God has not given up on you. If you're feeling like you are not worthy of God's attention, God has not given up on you. If you feel like your life is built on a house of cards that is about to tumble, God has not given up on you. If you feel like everything you do, like it's just pointless, nothing matters, God has not given up on you. No matter how you are feeling today, no matter what you have done or not done, God has not given up on you. That is the main point of the story of Noah. And that's why I believe it's important to remember. Because on that day, again, I don't remember what my friend responded, but I remember that day very, very vividly. On that day that I was deeply depressed in high school, what eventually sustained me was my connection to Jesus. Even though I couldn't understand why God would make such failed creatures as me. On that day in the children's hospital emergency room, when we learned our son was having dozens of seizures a day, what sustained me? My connection to Jesus. Even though I couldn't understand why God would allow children to suffer in that way. Didn't understand it. Still don't. On those days when I have made poor choices, on those days when I haven't been upright and blameless as Noah, on those days when I would have given up on me for failing again and again and again, what sustains me is my connection to Jesus, even though I wouldn't choose to die for someone like me. And so I encourage you. I encourage me, I encourage all of us to take God up on this covenant, on this promise, on this oath to not destroy us. On this promise to not give up on us. Now, how do we take him up on that? Well, to take him up on this promise not to destroy you requires not hiding. Because we can bring our failures to God and receive his forgiveness and love. Don't try to hide. Bring the part of your life that you would rather hide, the part of your life that you would rather not talk about. Bring that to God to receive his forgiveness and love. Don't try to hide. Even if you feel like you're like one of those supervillains in our text today, and you feel like I've got to bring every part of my life to God, go ahead and receive God's forgiveness and love. The first step to prepare our hearts this Lenten season is to admit that we are not upright and blameless. Now that observation, that might be obvious to everyone who knows us. Or that might be something that's hidden, even from the people who know us best. But either way, God knows. And even knowing what God knows, even knowing in advance, God chose to make you and me and all of us. He doesn't give up on you. He loves you. If you're listening to this and you want to experience that kind of love and forgiveness, but you don't know where to start, send me an email or send the church a Facebook message. I'd be honored to walk with you through discovering what that process means for you right now in your life. One of my son's favorite songs says there's one thing that remains, one thing stronger than anything else in life, higher than every challenge, stronger even than the power of the grave. One thing remains. Your love never fails, never gives up, never runs out on me. On and on and on and on it goes. It overwhelms and satisfies my soul, and I never ever have to be afraid because your love never fails. It never gives up, and it never runs out on me. That never-ending love comes from a promise, a covenant that started with Noah and was finally fulfilled in Jesus. And so I encourage you to take even that part of your life that no one knows about. Bring it to God in prayer. Accept the covenant that he made not to destroy us. Accept his forgiveness. Experience his love that never fails, that never gives up, that never runs out on you. Amen.